Remember when Cheeto Hitler was just a hollow and milquetoast own the libs used to lean on? Yeah, remember when for years actual survivors of the Holocaust were like, "Hey, this is pretty scary, guys." It's kind of like when I was a kid growing up under Hitler. Um, yeah, it turns out those weren't jokes or like weird, like far left, like fringe things. They were just honest assessments of what was happening. Um, and I think for a long time, one thing that Republicans are really good at is plausible deniability. So and it's also plausible deniability is also something that liberals fall for all the time. Um, and in this case, I think that's something that's very obviously happened. Like I'm not a fascist. I just won't condemn white supremacy ever. Like people kept getting upset at the outbursts that Trump would have that clearly indicated that he was a fascist and was consolidating fascist power. Um, but then they would fall for the efforts of right wing media to kind of downplay those or like gaslight. Oh, you misheard. Oh, he didn't mean it. Oh, he was joking. Like all of these tactics work really really well on liberals who want to play by the rules and feel like they are winning honestly when their opponents do not care about either of those things. So that's part of what makes these times so scary, people. Clay, you're old enough to be president. What have you done with your life? Come on, man. Clay, maybe you need to. Clay, maybe you need to run for local office. Maybe get into politics. Help us change the country. Because honestly, if you're watching this and you think you might be able to run for office, you probably can. And you know what? Maybe you should. Because a lot of local elections are very winnable. And being able to kind of build yourself up from a local level to a national one is something that we really, really need for our candidates. I'd lose your teaching job so fast. Yeah, you know what? Maybe when it's time for you to retire, that's when you take up your political mantle. One of my teachers in high school actually is doing that. His name is Steve Swadzinski. He's running in Minnesota as a Democrat, and everything I know about him from having like been taught like history by him. He taught like advanced like college level history courses. And he's a good leftist egg. I think he will have some good policies. So I'm excited to vote for him in the upcoming election. Actually, um, but I think teachers, especially teachers who have served for a long time, tend to do really well in politics. So something to think about. A lot of his supporters think he's not sophisticated enough to be a fascist. They're really like he's a hothead, which they perceive as honesty. Part of the problem, and okay, so we're going to talk about this for a little bit because one of the things that has bugged me for years is the idea that people continually just take Nazis at face value. And what I mean by that is like people have this historical view of the Nazis that is based on Nazi propaganda of what Nazis were and like what Nazis said about themselves. And so for a lot of people, Nazis are synonymous with fascists. And so when people are like, "Oh, he's not sophisticated enough to be a fascist," or like, your average Republican isn't sophisticated enough to be a fascist. The issue there is that sophistication is not a prerequisite for being a fascist. In fact, you don't need like shiny uniforms and like be goose stepping down the street as part of like a military parade in order to be a fascist. And that's one of the greatest misconceptions that I think that we as Americans have allowed to take root post World War II is that Nazi propaganda was accurate to life. And that like the Nazi war machine was as great a threat as like everyone kept saying when like in reality it was a threat, but they were led by a bunch of morons who kept getting lucky or who kept riding the coattails of like people who were actually talented who would then get like thrown out of the government. And like one thing that the Nazis did very well with their propaganda was establish this image of them being very polished and very in sync with one another and very powerful. They projected power. And you know what? That's one of the things that fascists do. It is one of the things that fascists do. You know what Trump does? He projects power, and that's why a lot of people like him. Like he talks about how our missiles are the biggest and the best, how we are going to have we're going to rain fire and fury, the likes of which you've never seen. Like he talks like that because that's the way a fascist talks. And you don't need to be sophisticated in order to be like that guy at the bar who's like talking about like how big his muscles are and how he can beat up anybody, and like how also like maybe like the gays shouldn't be here and like they're actually the ones stealing the jobs or something like that. Like those are like the very small level prerequisites for being a fascist. And the problem is we took that guy at the bar and made him a like president of the United States. And I think that like that kind of resonates with people. It resonates with a lot of people who have those fascist leanings, or who want those easy answers. The biggest failure of American World War II education is that we taught the Holocaust and what the Nazis were, but nothing about what they believed. True, and to be 100% fair about that, it is incredibly hard to, I think, convey what fascism is to people, especially because fascism as an ideology is very nebulous and adapts very easily to different situations. And so I think it's one of those things where like we needed not just like a course on World War II, we needed a course specifically about fascism. Um, that's something that we needed. We needed people to understand what this was, why it was a threat, and to be able to recognize it. And instead, basically all we got was like, oh, the Nazis from Indiana Jones, they were fascists and nothing else. That's it. Maybe some Italians too. But that's it. Let's see. Clearly, Nazis only wanted more power and killing the others. Nothing else. Nope. Not that's all Nazism is. True. Honestly, a banana a go-go. True. Umberto Eco's Fascism is very good. And I would actually encourage everyone to go and go read the 14 points. It's like the best summary of what fascism is, and Umberto Eco knew firsthand. He's a very noted philosopher who grew up under fascism in Italy. So, let's see here. Umberto Eco, fascism. All right. Okay. Yeah, we've got here are the 14 points for people who've never looked at Umberto Eco. You have a cult of tradition. One has only to look at the syllabus of every fascist movement to find the major traditionalist thinkers. The Nazi gnosis was nurtured by traditionalist, syncretistic, occult elements. So basically, you're creating like this foundational myth of your society with fascism. Like you're talking about like the golden age of how things were better way back when. You're talking about like and you're kind of adding like an element of mysticism to it. Like and for America, that is like American exceptionalism. Like, you know, we have this God-given document, and we have, you know, we are singular among nations for having like created America, and like all of this nonsense that really doesn't mean anything to the modern day. But that's all of that kind of helps like the pre-existence of those ideas and like like what am I thinking of? The word manifest destiny, like stuff like that, uh, are things that lend themselves to this cult of tradition that fascists can build up, and Trump certainly has. Then there is the rejection of modernism. The Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, is seen as the beginning of modern depravity. In this sense, fascism can be defined as irrationalism. So, modernism is something that you will see a lot of people on the far right talking about all the time when it comes to all kinds of different media, right? Like whether they're talking about games or books or movies, they harp on about like this, yeah, the cultural Marxists or whatever. Like they talk a lot about kind of this the modernism. If you go on PragerU, I believe PragerU has a whole ton of videos about how the Enlightenment was actually like not good, despite the fact that the Enlightenment basically took the squabbling, mud-drenched city-states and kingdoms of Europe and turned them into the modern world. And like Adam Smith was an Enlightenment thinker. Like all kinds, all these different things are ridiculous. The founding fathers themselves were Enlightenment thinkers. But we have reached such a state in our kind of cultural conversation that a lot of people are just like, yeah, and the Enlightenment was really bad. Like we had a lot of progress before then, and like it's not, whatever. Like blah blah blah. Like they just like word vomit that doesn't mean anything and isn't based on history at all. But it's this idea that again, like our modern age sucks. We need to go back to that golden era that we talked about in point two. Then we have the cult of action for action's sake. Action being beautiful in itself, it must be taken before or without any previous reflection. Thinking is a form of emasculation. And I think that last point is where we're at in the United States. Thinking is a form of emasculation. And this is why for a lot of people in like living in anti-intellectual areas of the country associate like higher education and learning with like femininity. There's this idea that like using your time to think and like invent and be creative are things that are inherently not masculine. And this is also why a lot of their rhetoric is built around masculinity, and returning to what like a fictional made up version of what masculinity was, as kind of like their ideal, despite the fact that like what people consider masculinity now is not what masculinity was, and femininity now is not what femininity was back then. Like women wear pants now. Did you know that like 50 years ago women couldn't wear pants? like like or, okay, maybe 60 years ago, because I'm old, so I miscalculated the age, but like 60 years ago in like the 1960s, did you know that cops would raid bars and they would inspect people at the bars to make sure that they were wearing their government mandated gender appropriate garments? Because by law, people had to wear 3 articles of clothing that belonged to their gender. And you know what wasn't one of the articles of clothing that was that belonged to women? Pants. If you were wearing pants, that counted as dressing as the opposite gender. That was that was a strike against you, not just like socially, but legally. So like, and of course it depended on where you were in the United States, but in general, in a broad sense, that's true. There were people specifically a lot of gay, queer, trans people who went to prison in the 1950s and 1960s because cops broke into a bar and lined everybody up, expected, like, had them pull their pants down and made sure that they were what they were wearing conformed to what they should be wearing, and if they weren't, they went to jail. Like, that's a factual thing. um and it's actually pretty shocking. But if you want to learn more, I've been reading a really fantastic book. I forget what the title is. Let me go get it. It's called Captive Genders, and it's basically like an examination of the kind of intersection of queerness and transness with the legal and prison system. So check that out. It's a pretty good book. Turning off my phone. Okay, so we're 3 points in, and we so far we are at action is for action's sake, and not only that, but action is also masculine, and thinking or creativity is a form of losing your masculinity or becoming more feminine. Okay, number 4, disagreement is treason. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. So, let's see. Oh, wait, I skipped a part. The critical spirit makes distinctions, and to distinguish is a sign of modernism. So, this, I think, is also why a lot of people have come to the idea that criticizing something is bad, because critique is to make distinctions and to, like, call for improvements. So in let's take a look here. In modern culture, the scientific community praises disagreement as a way to improve knowledge. And so in this sense, you have the kind of anti-intellectual head rearing itself again. So you to disagree to disagree with Trump is to basically be aligning yourself against America, even if your disagreement is based on like criticizing something in order to improve it. Your disagreement is a sign of your treason. And if you look at conservative message boards, they will literally say as much. Pants for women was a thing in the 40s. Uh, True, but also when my parents were going to school in the 1960s, my my mom couldn't wear pants. That was like against the rules, and people in the 1960s were also arrested for wearing pants. Um, so those things can both be true. Um, Fear of difference. The first appeal of a fascist or prematurely fascist movement is an appeal against the intruders. Thus, fascism is racist by definition. So not only that, but I think in 2020 we're seeing that for this kind of fascist movement among the far right, we're seeing also the not only racism, which largely they understand they can't be explicitly racist or as explicitly racist as they were in the past. So they're kind of reaching out to bring in more groups. And I think right now, kind of the in group to be highlighted as intruders would be trans people, because it's easy to kind of be like, well, not only are they emasculated, especially if you're a trans woman, but you are like flying in the face of like what you're kind of a sign of how messed up our times are. You're flying in the face of what our glorious past was. Like we trans people kind of check all of those boxes for these fascists, and it makes them an easy target. Number six, appeal to social frustration. One of the most typical features of this historical fascism was the appeal to a frustrated middle class, a class suffering from economic crisis or feelings of political humiliation and frightened by the pressure of lower social groups. And I think that this is actually especially pertinent now, when we're seeing kind of this rise in militia activity, specifically because we're seeing a lot of these militias, and they're carrying a lot of heavy duty weaponry. And you know what it takes to get that heavy duty weaponry and like the military vests and like be able to take days off so you can go marching in a different state to intimidate protesters who just want justice for black people. It takes money. You have to be a middle class person working a middle class job in order to have that sort of freedom. And so this fascist aspect particularly appeals to these middle class people who are frustrated because of, as we mentioned yesterday in our segment about the FBI warning about like COVID-related stressors really turning this time period between the first debate and the election into a particularly dangerous moment for white supremacist violence. The pressures from COVID are kind of bringing a lot of this to a head. People in that group who are already frustrated and have been alienated by capitalist overlords and who are instead of recognizing the source of their alienation as coming from above, think that it is coming from some unknown and powerful source that lies below them in the social stratification that exists underneath them. They, instead of taking up arms against the people who are actually oppressing them, decide that they will take up arms against the people who threaten their position in the pre-existing social structure. And that's entirely due to a fear that they might be replaced and fall down that social ladder. 7, obsessed with a plot, which I think maybe, just maybe, QAnon probably falls into that category. And if people on the right aren't into QAnon specifically, they're still under the impression from mainstream right-wing media that their president is under attack by these nefarious and scheming Democrats who have like a plan to try and oust him out of power, and it's all kinds of ridiculous fear-mongering over this, when like in actuality the Democrats are just as corporate as the Republicans and barely put up a fight in most cases. So let's see. Okay. Oh, and also, good point in chat, a banana a go-go. Critical race theory as being like some sort of plot by black people or like the intelligentsia to rewrite the glorious past that we've had. Like the obsession with a plot is kind of in that similar vein, as if there is some sort of plot that people want to erase our past for reasons, I guess. Like that's kind of where that falls. Number 8, I think a lot of people are familiar with this one. The enemy is both strong and weak. And you can see this reflected in a lot of Trump's speeches, like all the time. Trump talks about how Democrats are kind of these weak pansies who, like, he makes fun of Joe Biden for wearing a mask all the time, and like, calls him stupid, and like you're the like never use the word smart again, or like they talk about how like liberals are weak and soy boys, and like all of these phrasing, like liberals are cucks, and all of that falls into this category of, well, my enemy is weak, but also my weak enemy is overwhelmingly powerful and capable of pulling off nation-spanning plots to destroy real American culture. Like that, like those two things don't mix, right? They don't mix at all. Um, but let's see what Eco says about it. By a continuous shifting of rhetorical focus, the enemies are at the same time too strong and too weak. True. Very accurate. Number 9, pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. For fascism, there is no struggle for life, but rather life is lived for struggle. So basically, if you are saying that you are a fascist, it is, or if you are saying you are a pacifist, you are saying that you are not part of the struggle, which means you are a potential enemy for a fascist. And it's kind of this part of the ideology that really like ropes in pretty much everyone who's not a fascist. And it's why fascism cannot coexist alongside other ideologies, alongside you know, whatever their targets are, especially because fascism ropes everyone into either being a fascist or a not fascist. And if you aren't a fascist, that means you are the enemy of fascism, which is why pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Number 10, contempt for the weak. Elitism, I'm talking a lot. Elitism is a typical aspect of any reactionary ideology. So basically, any of the ways that someone might be privileged over someone else, whether that is having a more able body, or having like a higher social status, or having a more economic status, they are expected to be contemptuous of those below them. And you know what? I think that this also applies to if you are like kind of the object of contempt for people above you, you in turn believe that you are worthy of that contempt. And I think that it's kind of like this cycle that kind of goes up and down the social hierarchy. Um, oh, it's not Outlook. I'm glad I had my glad I had my camera over here. Um, Everybody is educated to become a hero, which is this point right here, number 11, is particularly why Trump's statement about patriotic education is especially troubling, because it really, really plays into this point. In fascist ideology, heroism is the norm. This cult of heroism is strictly linked with the cult of death. So the idea here, especially the idea behind patriotic education, is to show that our country is the best country on earth, and our country is worth dying for. And not only that, but some of our greatest patriots died to make this country happen. So, and with the unsaid words and sentiment being, and so should you. So, when they're talking about patriotic education, the pinnacle of patriotism is laying your life down for your country. That's what they're trying to indoctrinate you and your children to do. And while that might sound like a good thing, if you're laying your life down for a fascist country, that is a horrible sacrifice, and frankly a wasted one. Number 12, machismo and weaponry. Machismo implies both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. So, yeah, I feel like this is pretty self-evident, and a lot of these points I think build off of past ones. So like, you know, this makes it clear that fascism is largely built around the idea of the masculine, what it means to be a man. And I think that for a lot of people living in our modern society, being a man is really difficult. Like, I'm not going to downplay that. Like, I will also admit that in some ways men are privileged, but also there are a lot of ways that that privilege comes back and hurts them, or isolates them, or makes them particularly susceptible to building their identity off of being a man and having the idea of what being a man means built up by toxic ideas, which is what we talk about when we talk about toxic masculinity. Toxic masculinity doesn't mean that masculinity is toxic. It just means that there are elements that a lot of people incorporate into their masculinity that hurt both themselves and those around them. And so this is specifically, I think, with machismo. I think we could interpret that maybe as being toxic masculinity. Building the idea of what your masculinity means around hating women and around being grossed out by people who don't have sex, or by people who are gay or trans. And additionally, building your identity around the use of weapons and hurting people or animals. I think that's something that a lot of people do. And like, I do want to hammer home at this point that if you fall into any of these categories by themselves, doesn't necessarily mean you're a fascist, but it does mean that you are more susceptible to becoming a fascist. And so you should be aware of these things, and you should kind of maybe rethink your behaviors or beliefs to kind of make sure that you're not going down that road, or to maybe see if you could improve yourself somewhat. So number 13, selective populism. There is in our future a TV or internet populism in which the emotional response of a selected group of citizens can be presented and accepted as the voice of the people. And I think Umberto Eco is extremely on point with this, because in our internet age, we can now, as I did a segment on this actually the other day on Facebook, the Cambridge Analytica scandal with the Trump campaign allowed the Trump campaign to target specific Black people in order to dissuade millions of them from participating in the 2016 election. Successfully, I might add. So we have the means now to an individual, break them down and put them into kind of a selected group of citizens. We have the means to put together a digital voice of the people that can be used to justify large-scale policies that could affect minorities of citizens, and justify it as being like the will of the people, even if that is an artificially constructed digital category. And I think that Facebook is largely, due to the whims of capitalism, doing this already. And I think it has severely hurt our political discourse. And finally, point number 14, fascism speaks newspeak. All the Nazis or fascist school books made use of an impoverished vocabulary and an elementary syntax in order to limit the instruments for complex and critical reasoning. And I do want to say I'm not sure where America as a whole falls into this, but I do know that Trump and Trump's lexicon has slowly been seeping into the way that people talk and communicate about politics. It's very insidious, it's very slow, but I think that the way he talks has simplified a lot of our political discourse in an inherently negative way that is similar to newspeak. It's simplifying the kind of conversations we can have when the head of our country is unable to intelligently and coherently talk about different political ideas, and can only like bumble around and dog whistle or foghorn to violent supporters instead of just very clearly condemning white supremacy, which is what he did during the last debate just a couple days ago. So those are the 14 points of fascism. We just went over them. What do you all think, guys? Dang, Ashley, you stopped using Facebook 15 years ago? That's hats off to you, my friend. Yeah, exactly, Banana Go Go. Bigly, fake news. People are saying, these generalities that really harm our discourse. Yeah, exactly, done randomly. Like this is why that you find some people on the left who say that wide swaths of the general Republican electorate are fascist, and it's why it's all. This is also why, like, between I'm gonna look this up right now. What is Trump's popularity among Republicans? Presidential approval ratings. Let's take a look here. Overall, his job approval rating is 46%, which is surprisingly high. But let's take a look among Republicans. That's what we're interested in by party affiliation. Yeah, I was gonna say his approval among Republicans was in like the 80% range. I was wrong. It's 94%. 94% of the Republican Party approves of what Trump does and what he's doing. So I think it's fair to say, given that we've checked off pretty much every single box of Umberto Eco's list of what makes a fascist country or movement or ideology, I think it's fair to say that there is an overwhelming number of Republicans who, while they may not know it, they may not have the quote unquote sophistication to be able to recognize that they are fascist, would be considered fascism, according to the scholars who study fascism. um, so yeah, it's a real problem, and I'm not entirely sure how we win. Other than our next step needs to be electing Joe Biden as president of the United States, so that we don't give further credence or further power or further validation to this incredibly dangerous movement that has insidiously seeped into our country over the last several decades.